Greetings everyone, my name is Micah Russell. I'm the Masters of Environmental Management Program Director at Western Colorado University. I'm a watershed restoration researcher and practitioner. It is truly an honor to be invited to talk to you all at the Playa Symposium. I apologize I can't be there in person. I do hope to be there next time. So today I'm going to be talking about a study entitled Accounting for Effects of Hydrologic Modification and Intensifying Drought in Playa Restoration. I did this study while at University of Idaho with these colleagues. Some of my colleagues are with UI, some of them are with U.S. Geological Survey and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This research is a little bit dated now. It was published in Wetlands in 2020. Nevertheless, I'm pleased that there's interest and I'm open to collaboration. So if something in this research strikes you as useful to the area you're working in, please do reach out. Okay, so we were looking at Playa in the Northern Great Basin, a rather understudied part of the world. Principally, we're talking about southeastern Oregon, northwestern Nevada, and then northeastern California. These playa are very important to migrating waterfowl and shorebirds, particularly during the early spring migration. But of course, they are also important to local wildlife like pronghorn and to leasees who are grazing cattle on public lands. I got interested in these playa because of my knowledge of the area, but also in playing with the Global Surface Water Explorer, I noticed an alarming trend where many of these playas seem to be drying out over the last 30 years, becoming less reliable as seasonal habitat and moving towards more ephemeral, unreliable wetting. So these are pictures from the fall when most of these playa are desiccated and dry. On the left-hand side in figure A, you can see a playa with our truck for scale. The playas range quite dramatically in size, but they are typically dried out by the fall. On the right in figure B, you can see that an example of a playa that's been modified with a cattle dugout or a pit. This is a pit that's been dug in the middle of the playa to drain water into a holding tank for cattle. A lot of these were installed in the 1950s and 60s rather indiscriminately across the landscape. And of course that has reduced the ecosystem services that would have been provided in that shallow wetland environment. So I went down there and did some drone flights, got to know these habitats intimately, and talked to a bunch of different stakeholders. And what came out of those conversations was a common goal: to better understand playa hydrology and inform restoration planning efforts. And specifically, we wanted to examine the following questions. What is the status of playa inundation over the last 30 years? Are climate, surface area, and modification history drivers of this inundation? And are there any playas that remain wet in drought and provide hydrologic refugia? If so, how does this relate back to the patterns we discovered in playa modification? Ultimately, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is interested in restoring some of the playa on their properties to conditions that mirror what would have been there historically. And so they're looking to fill in some of these pits, restore the surface hydrology, and promote wetland functions. But they look to us to help them prioritize where to do that work and why. So a little more specific about the study area. Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge is in Oregon. It has 86 playa, and just across the border in Nevada is the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge, 67 playas. So we had a total sample size of 153 playa between those two places. Our surface water presence and absence data came from the Global Surface Water Explorer, 30 years worth from 1985 to 2015. And then we paired that with some climate data. So we were using the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, or SPEI, and we brought that in from the Westwide Drought Tracker. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service generously provided us with shapefiles of the playa plus annotated history on how they were modified and when, if that was known, as well as their surfaced area. So from there, we were able to build some models and explore the data and look at some trends. Let's start with the inundation trends. The minimum number of dry playa at any given time was 58. So about a third of the playa at any moment in time are dry, which is pretty typical of this area. A third of the playas were dry even in wet conditions. So regardless of the year, there were playa that were dried out. You have to remember that these playa are relying on a small amount of snowmelt to fill up, and then occasionally they're sustained by episodic and localized thunderstorms in the late spring and summer. And you can see a typical hydrograph in this figure where the number of playas wetted increases during spring and then dries out in summer. And that also happens to mirror the hydrograph of an individual playa. So what's driving inundation? Well, I'll refer you to the paper to really dig into how these models are set up, but essentially we're using generalized linear mixed effects modeling, and we discovered that inundation likelihood as well as inundation duration increases with wetter weather conditions. That's pretty intuitive, right? If it's wetter out there, you're going to get a higher probability of inundation and a higher probability of a longer duration inundation. These trends also held true for playas that were modified. So those playas with those cattle dugouts or pits were more likely to hold water and hold water longer. And we'll talk about what might be behind that when we get to the discussion. All right, so how are these playa going to fare into the future? Because we are anticipating intensifying drought. Well, we were able to use our models to predict those conditions, moving from average conditions to moderate conditions to severe and extreme drought. On the top figure, we have mean probability wet across those condition types. In the bottom figure, we have mean months wet across those condition types. Essentially what we found is that the inundation probability is expected to decrease from about 22% on average to 11% under extreme drought. Furthermore, and this is really important, the mean annual inundation decreases from about 2 months to 1 month. So those playa that are getting wet are likely to hold water a shorter time. And if that timing doesn't match up with the timing of the migrating wildlife that use these environments, then that could be trouble. And it would mean that some of their more reliable stopovers are further apart, that there are fewer of these smaller playa that are wetted to break up that trip. Okay, next, addressing the question of whether any of these playa can act as hydrological refugia. First, we need to define that for this study. We were looking for the playa that were inundated for at least 2 months in each of the 5 driest years in our study. So those years correspond to the dashed lines in this figure, with year on the x-axis and number of wet playas on the y-axis. And you can see that the number of wetted playa goes down dramatically when we have these dry years. And only 4% of playa were inundated for at least 2 months during those years. So that tells us, according to our definition, that 4% of playas could be considered hydrological refugia. These refugial playas were definitely larger and more likely to be modified. And there's something special going on with them with respect to their physical characteristics that allows them to retain this water, and we'll touch on that later. Okay, what are the implications for restoration planners with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Well, we've definitely identified some trends in inundation. We identified some things to keep in mind with intensifying drought and where there might be playa that are especially important for conservation or restoration with respect to hydrologic refugia. But we also discovered that some of the playa, their pits are not in intuitive locations. So on the left in figure A and B, we have April versus July for one playa. And the red is the location of the dugout. The blue and green, that just indicates that those particular cells were inundated with water. So you can see that, not surprisingly, this playa is drying out. It's in the process of drying out come July. And the pit is right in the middle. If you move over, though, you'll see another playa nearby that shows the same seasonal pattern of inundation between April and July, but the dugout is not in the right place to actually collect any water. It's peripheral to the actual inundation area. So it's quite possible that when these things were being installed, they were eyeballing it and may have misplaced a few of these dugouts along the way so that they're ineffective. So there's no point in filling that dugout in and spending resources at these locations. So all of this is to illustrate that while the trends we identified are a great starting place, it will take some site-specific analysis to make effective decisions with respect to planning, restoration, and monitoring. Again, localized weather conditions are an important predictor of playa inundation. Modification history is a significant predictor of inundation, but not necessarily causal. And what I mean by that is it's very likely that the people that installed these dugouts across the landscape were equipped with hyper-localized local knowledge. And so they may have been selecting for playa that, in their experience, were more reliably wet during dry years, which would explain why some of our hydrologic refugia are more likely to have these pits. So it's really hard to untease or untangle a causal relationship here, but we do know that it's a significant relationship. So again, fewer playas will be inundated, and inundation duration will be shorter with intensifying droughts, which really emphasizes the need to restore and conserve what we can, and to use science to really lead the way in helping to determine which playa deserve these resources and which are more than likely going to remain dry going forward. So, as I said, some site-specific assessment is going to be needed, and really to adequately assess the effect of climate change on playa in this area, as well as the effectiveness of restoration. The next step is to move from our landscape scale remote sensing approach, which was a good start, to a more local experimental design that tackles the geomorphology and the hydrogeology of these playa, really trying to hone in on what makes some playa more likely to sustain water than others. And this kind of information is also going to be essential to letting us know if our expectations around restoration are reasonable. So lots of people to thank. Everybody with a logo here provided expertise or data or both. Of course, some colleagues at University of Idaho were essential for me getting this work done. And finally, the data and the code for this work are available through the Northwest Knowledge Network. So if you want to see under the hood as to how we did this, I encourage you to check that out. That's it. I hope you found something helpful in this study that can apply to your work wherever you're working. And if you're interested in collaborating on future projects, please consider getting in touch. I can be reached at mrussell@western.edu, and I look forward to hearing you. Thank you all.